My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm president of the Sousa Mendes Foundation. And I'm excited to be moderating a virtual conversation around the film, The Legacy of Aristides, which is premiering at this year's festival. The filmmaker of this film is Patrick Serodi, a Frenchman who has devoted his career to documenting the impact of World War II on France. And many people don't realize that the action of the Holocaust rescuer Aristides de Sousa Mendes was in fact the largest rescue action on French soil. I am pleased today to welcome my three guests who, in addition to myself, are in the film. My guests are Gerald de Sousa Mendes, the grandson of the hero Aristides de Sousa Mendes, Mr. Henri Dyner, who in 1940 personally received a life-saving visa from Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and Cookie Fischer, whose mother was saved by this hero. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to start with Gerald. So Gerald, could you tell us a little bit about your grandfather? Who was he and what did he do?
My grandfather was Aristides de Sousa Mendes. He was a Portuguese diplomat, born in 1885 in Cabanas de Viriato, a few hours after his twin brother Caesar. And both grew up, studied in Coimbra University in law, and got into diplomatic careers. So he married Angelina, my grandmother, who was his first cousin, in 1909. And from there on started a long career that brought them from Zanzibar to California to Brazil to Belgium, Spain, and Bordeaux in 1938, where these events all happened. So throughout through these years, they had 14 children. My father was the second last, born in 1928. And he also had the 15th daughter with André Sibial, who became later on, after my grandmother died, his second wife. So in 1940, as we all know, France surrendered to Germany, and thousands and thousands of refugees were migrating, escaping for their lives, going towards the south of France to hope to be able to go to Spain or to Portugal, which was supposedly neutral. So as all this migration happened and the thousands of people came to Bordeaux, Aristides started issuing visas, first asking permission to the government, which was permissions that were almost never given. And then came Circular 14, which forbid to issue visas to a lot of communities, including Jews. So as this migration into Bordeaux was very important, hundreds of thousands of persons came to Bordeaux in a few days, in a few weeks. And a lot were lining up in front of the consulate in Bordeaux. So he decided to start issuing visas without permissions against Circular 14.
And was he punished for this? What happened to him?
So yes, he was punished. So after the events, he returned to Portugal, to his family in Cabanas de Viriato in late June. But in a matter of a few weeks, he was called to Lisbon by the Minister of Foreign Affairs to be sanctioned. So he had to suffer an administrative trial where he was punished at first by a few months of layoff, followed by a forced retirement with minimal revenue, which wasn't easy because he had a large family. So the family stayed in Cabanas de Viriato and hoped that his case would be reviewed by Salazar at the end of the war, which never happened. Actually, Salazar tightened what he was a rock. He tightened the punishment and condemned Aristides to being forgotten. So as despair slowly installed, the children one by one started leaving. Some of them left before the end of the war. Two of my uncles who were born in California joined the U.S. Army, the U.S. forces after 1942. And at the end of the war, they went to the U.S. and where they helped a lot of their brothers and sisters to immigrate as well to the United States.
Now you were born in Canada, right? Because your father went to Canada. So tell us a little bit about his story, your father. How come he went to Canada?
So my father was the last one to leave his parents in Cabanas de Viriato. He left when my grandmother passed away in 1948. And he went to Canada where he had his family, they had a family contact who accepted to help my father immigrate to Canada, where he met my mother and became an engineer. My older sister and younger brother were born in Montreal. So we're the Canadian branch, and we have branches in the US and France and Belgium and Germany also, and in Portugal today. A lot of my cousins today live in Portugal. And I don't know if I can mention this, but after the war, many of my aunts and uncles, including my aunt Joanna, my uncle John Paul, who was the youngest, my uncle Sebastian, my father, never stopped working to get their father rehabilitated in Portugal. Came the revolution in 1974, the fall of the dictatorship. It still took another 14 years for the Portuguese government to restore, to rehabilitate Aristides in Portugal. And this was thanks to a lot of people in the US, including Robert Jacobitz and in France, Manuel Dias, and people who supported my aunts and uncles in this effort to rehabilitate Sousa Mendes.
So Portugal was in fact the last country to acknowledge him, right? Because it started in Israel, 1966, he was made righteous among the nations. And then there was a big lobbying effort in the United States. So there were a lot of ceremonies and events to honor his memory here in the United States and a little bit in Canada as well. And finally, it happened in Portugal, thanks to, I guess, outside pressure and the change of government from a dictatorship to a democracy. But even then, it took some years, right?
Right. It took in 1966 there was Yad Vashem, where he that's actually at that time that I learned about the story, because in 1967 Rabbi Kruger, who took part also in assisting Aristides with this distributing of visas, Rabbi Kruger invited the children of Aristides in New York to tell them his version of the story, and and so that was actually the first time that my father was able to witness some type of commemoration of what his father had done. And when he came back to Montreal, he talked about that story, and that's when I learned. I was 10.
So it lifted a certain weight off of his shoulders, perhaps.
Yes, probably. I think it did. Things really started changing in 1986, 1987, and then he passed away in early 1988. So he didn't witness the rehabilitation of his father, but at least he knew that things were changing, and and as you say, throughout the years with the rehabilitation and a lot of events and the creation of the Sousa Mendes Foundation, the creation of the Comité Français in Bordeaux, all the efforts of in Portugal also with school teachers, families, students, that contributed to remove the story on the families from the family's shoulders. It
lightened your load a little bit.
I'm sorry?
It lightened your load a little bit.
It lightened the load, and today we're happy to see that the story belongs to humanity, and that things are moving on. Today, Aristides, well, there's the story, but there's also the lessons of the past that are being carried by for education. But we do have, as a family, we do keep an eye on, unfortunately, today in 2021, we hear about some revisionism and sometimes extreme right, even in Portugal, saying that this story is invented and there were only a few thousand and that Jews were not in danger, and that my grandfather was he was corrupted, asking for money to the refugees and so on. So we're keeping an eye on that as family, with and not hesitating to react with laws and courts when things go too far.
Thank you, Gerald. So now I'm going to turn to Mr. Henri Dyner, who, Henri, you yourself were one of these fortunate visa recipients in 1940, but more than that, you and your family are what we at the Sousa Mendes Foundation called a gold standard family, which means that we have documentary proof that the Portuguese government denied visas to your family members. There's a surviving telegram to Sousa Mendes saying, do not issue visas to, and it mentions your family by name and many other families in that particular telegram. But of course, Sousa Mendes defied that order and he issued the visas anyway for your family. So you are here specifically as a result of an act of defiance. So what does that mean to you? And when did you first learn of the story?
Well, it means obviously a lot to me, the story of Sousa Mendes. I was actually fortunate to be, when I grew up in Brazil, I was familiarized with the story of Sousa Mendes probably around the late 60s, early 70s. And my parents talked to me about Sousa Mendes, what he had done. And later on, after my father passed away, and I was spending more time with my mother, and she was aging, this story actually, every time, there was more and more aspects of the story that came about. So I was very familiar with the story about Sousa Mendes, and obviously, as I say to my family, I got 2 sons and 4 grandchildren. They are here as a result of the action and the courage of Sousa Mendes. I would say that the story of Sousa Mendes became even more vivid after a couple of years ago. I went on the trip, the road on freedom, was it the Road to Freedom journey on the Road to Freedom, organized by the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and then I had the opportunity to visit the consulate in Bordeaux, basically the route that we took in 1940, including the bridge between France and Spain, and particularly the Villa Formosa, which is the train station where refugees went off the train after crossing Spain. Also, it was when I saw the Villa Formosa, I started remembering actually that train station. Also, I had someone who went to Figueira da Foz. There was also some I was familiar with a little bit with that view, knew that I had been there. So that trip was actually quite emotional for me, and also for my wife, who came with me. And I just think that this, I've been very fortunate, and I'm here as a result of that. We left actually Belgium in 1940. I was 3 years old. We ended up in June 1940 in Bordeaux, where the thousand refugees were asking for a visa. Actually, I would say that Sousa Mendes played a double role in our lives. Not only was he the one who granted visas to our family and enabled us to escape the Nazis, but also he was instrumental in getting us to South America. And the reason was that my mother knew Sousa Mendes from the time that Sousa Mendes was Consul General of Portugal in Antwerp. And she met him through the English consulate, where she was a secretary to the consul. And when she met Sousa Mendes in 1940 in Bordeaux, and after he gave her the visa to the family and to herself, she said, "Look, you're going to go to Portugal now, and I'm sure you don't know where you're going to end up. You'll try many places to get a visa, but it's not going to be easy," which was an understatement, of course, because too many countries refused to give visas to refugees like us. And he said, "Look, I do have a friend of mine in Portugal, Lisbon, who is the honorary consul of Paraguay, who is an industrialist called Lucio Ferreira. And if you don't get any visa anywhere, go to him, he will help you." And sure enough, we ended up there getting a visa actually to Paraguay. He was an honorary consul of Paraguay. So he gave us a visa to Paraguay, which allowed us to take the ship in 1941, which was the Cape of Good Hope ship. It was supposed to have been the last ship leaving Europe before the Germans were going to invade Portugal. We left in end of April 1941. And the ship stopped at many ports on the way to Paraguay. One of them was Buenos Aires. And I was very sick. I'd been very sick in Portugal for quite a number of months. Turns out, I had TB. But so my mother got off the ship to get help from doctors. But also she went to visit the president of the Jewish Foundation in Buenos Aires, which allowed us to get a temporary visa for 90 days in Buenos Aires. And we ended up in Argentina for a couple of years until Ferreira, who stayed in touch with our family, because my father was a technical person. He started a glass factory in Portugal, which was Covina. And then, actually, no, he inherited a Covina. And then he started a company, a glass company in Brazil, where he wanted to have my father help him out. So in 43, he sponsored us to come to Brazil. And that is where I spent my young years until 1961. Basically, I did all my studies in Rio de Janeiro. And I graduated as a mechanical engineer in 1960. And after that, went on a scholarship to the States to get a graduate degree, and the rest is history.
Wonderful. Let me turn now to our third guest, Cookie Fischer. So Cookie, your mother was a visa recipient, but you, as opposed to Henri and Gerald and myself, we've all known the story for many years. You, in your own personal case, you found out about the story only recently. So tell us how you learned about Sousa Mendes and his connection to your family and what it has meant to you.
Well, thank you, Olivia. It's a very unusual story because I only heard about my mother's escape 4 years ago. The details came out on the first trip I did with the Sousa Mendes Foundation in 2017 on the journey to the road to freedom. And it was shocking. My mother never told the story for many reasons. I'm not sure how. And of course, now I don't have anybody to ask for details or for her stories of family members. Nobody knew about this. But I thought I would give you a little bit of a background of my mother's life and tie it into the story of her escape. My full name is Jeannette Valérie Fischer, but everybody calls me Cookie. My mother was Adèle Vandenberg Fischer, and she was born in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, in May 1925. So she was 25 when all this happened. My father, whom she met later in the 50s, was François Fischer, and he was born in Brussels, Belgium. But thanks to the visa that was issued by Aristides Sousa Mendes, my mother was able to escape Bayonne. So we were talking about Bordeaux, but he also worked the consulate in Bayonne. He was responsible for the consulate in Bayonne in France. And so her escape was on June 22nd, 1940. And what's very curious about this story, I'm not sure curious is the right word, but just a week or so later, he returned to Portugal. He was returned. So thanks to Aristides Sousa Mendes, I am here today to tell her story. She escaped from Bayonne in a sardine schooner with 5 of her cousins. Her family was back in the Netherlands, and her grandparents who had traveled with her to, first they went to Bordeaux, there were too many people. They went to Biarritz, there were too many people. And they ended up in Bayonne, but they were elderly, they were in their 70s, and they decided they couldn't go on this sardine schooner, so they went back to Nice. So this sardine schooner, smelling sardines, and had only transported sardines, sailed from Bayonne all through the northern coast of Spain to arrive in Portugal. I have no idea how she made her way to Lisbon, but on August 28th, 1940, she sailed on the Excalibur to New York City. So if you ask who I am and how I'm related to this, I am what is known as a third culture kid. So as a child, third culture kid child, we grow up in different cultures from our culture of birth and different from the parents' cultures. And this means the reference, it has to do with mixed identities that a child assumes, and it's influenced by different cultures, so it's a blend of cultures. And personally, I call it my multiple umbilical cords. So right now I have about 10 of them. Why is this relevant? Originally, the term referred to children of diplomats, people who worked in international organizations, people who relocate globally every few years. Some of you might have heard the term, or maybe you even identify with it. It's a term that has come up about 25 years ago. But now, and this is the relevance to the story, it includes children of refugee families and all those families that have been displaced globally due to political, economic, or even natural disaster. So Gerald spoke about this. Aristides Sousa Mendes was a diplomat. He had 15 children who were born in the different countries he served. So these children would be considered third culture kids. And as he lived in the early 20th century, you can imagine the experiences, the many moves and transitions, adapting to different cultures, acquiring languages, hearing different languages, working in different languages, and sometimes even living in places where they were confronted with very challenging human conditions in the beginning, in the early 20th century. So this empathy and humanity, his empathy and humanity drove his actions. And this was the formation of his moral compass, also his faith. Again, how does this, no, sorry, go ahead.
So I want to take us back to the film. The film is not a traditional documentary, which is why I thought it was important to have you all as my guests, because we're not even identified in the film except at the end in the credits. So I thought it was important for each of you to explain a little bit about who you are. But the film begins in what appears to be kind of a haunted house. You're not quite sure what it is at first. And the way that the film is created, it's like little puzzle pieces that are gradually put together. So I'm hoping we might put some of these puzzle pieces together for the audience, starting with the house. So Gerald, let me turn back to you and ask you about this house. What is it? And tell us why it's in the condition that it is.
Yes. The house was the family house. At first, it was a one-story house that Aristides and Angelina inherited from one of their uncles, who was a bishop. And in 1920, they added 2 floors, and it became this big three-level, 3-story house, over 13,000 square feet, like a big house, 25 rooms, a big statue of Christ the Redeemer on the side of the property, overlooking the property and the mountains of Serra da Estrela in the distance. And that's where the family would come during the summer and during all these years, and they stayed there until the end of the war, even a bit later. As Aristides was falling and was crushed by debt, the house was he went bankrupt, and the house was sold for nothing, and it was abandoned. It was left abandoned since. So since about 1950, it was totally abandoned, and it deteriorated. It was collapsing. It became a symbol of the punishment of Salazar over there in Portugal. And it's only in in 2000, a foundation was created in Portugal, the Fundação Aristides de Sousa Mendes, and as a repair from the rehabilitation, the government bought the house back and gave it to the foundation for it to become a museum. So it continued, that happened in 2000, and it continued collapsing until about 2015, when it was finally restored and solidified from the outside. And now it's going to become a museum, so we should see the inside being restored as well, and the museum should open probably around 2023. So
That will
yeah,
be a
that's
wonderful
probably the
moment
house.
when that
That
happens.
would be a beautiful, yes.
Yes, and we'll all be there.
As we
Henry,
can see when we walk in the house, it's old. There's, you can almost feel and see ghosts, and that's there's all the decorations. So it's the state that it's in also testifies or reminds of how it looked, how it might have looked, and family times as well.
yes. Henry, turning to you, I would like you to speak a little bit about what you feel are the most important lessons we can learn and ways that the story can be disseminated, because the film is called The Legacy of Aristides. So what to you is the legacy and how can it be disseminated?
Great question. I see the Aristides de Sousa Mendes, to me, is not only he's not only a Portuguese. He's a figure of humanity. His example transcends the borders of Portugal. In fact, I mentioned this when we were in Lisbon during a trip, that I said that Aristides Sousa Mendes belongs in the Pantheon of Portugal, and with Portuguese heroes like Vasco da Gama, Infante Dom Henrique, Luigi Camões. And it's an example for all times. Particularly, I think his example is important in today's world. Unfortunately, what is going on everywhere, not only in the United States, but also in some parts of Europe, is that we not only do we have a renewal of racism and bigotry, but I think that you have politicians who are not looking at what is right, but are looking what is a short-term benefit to them, either in their pocket or in power. You know, politicians do reason on the basis of what's it in for me? How can my action help me be reelected? Instead of doing what Aristides Sousa Mendes did, which is consult your faith or your conscience. You know, what Aristides Sousa Mendes did was, he said, when he said, I prefer to be with God against men than men against God, was basically saying, I'm going to do what is right. And I think his example, it's interesting that we, older people, not as old as I am, but even people who are in their 30s or 40s or 60s know about Aristides Sousa Mendes. Yes, it's interesting that they should know about it, but where the example can really make an impact is in younger people. It is in schools, and whether it is at the end of primary school or certainly high school, it deserves at least a few hours lecture on what did Aristides Sousa Mendes do in 1940? Who was he? And why did he do what he did? What was the process through which he decided to disobey Salazar? And he disobeyed Salazar and did what he felt was right. The more people we have that will inspire themselves on the example of Sousa Mendes, the better off our world will be. So I think that's important that this be introduced in curriculum, or if not in curriculum, not a complete curriculum, but maybe a few hours of lectures. It is something that young people will be receptive, and it may inspire them in how they behave later on in life. I think I told you the story I have when I got 4 grandchildren living in California. One is 11, 2 are 9, and 1 is 6. And a few weeks ago, I was there and visiting with the family who lives in Los Angeles, and my grandson, Aaron, his name, he asked me, he said, vovô, which means grandfather in Brazilian, said, "Vovô, you know, I've been asking school to write a biography, and I had to choose two. I had to choose two people to write their biography." So, you know, he's 9 years old, and he said, "You know, I chose you, vovô, and Aristides Sousa Mendes." And I thought it was great because we talk about in our family, we talk about Sousa Mendes even when we get together. And I think these are the kind of things that, you know, we really need to promote. And I think that, you know, Olivia, you mentioned that, you know, you guys are doing this in the Sousa Mendes Foundation, you know, having groups of educators being exposed to the example. I think this is very important.
Wonderful. So, Cookie, what would you like to add? I mean, you've told us a little bit about your mother's story, but what is the meaning of this whole story for you personally?
So what we learned is the issue of being able to develop empathy, to adapt, we look at refugees who have to move from one place to the other. How do we look at these movements? My mother was a social worker. She got her degree in the University of Brussels before the war. She worked with refugee organizations, saving between 600 and 700 children, smuggling them out of Germany. And she was a beacon. She was influenced by this trauma, and she helped children and adults in overcoming their own physical and mental disabilities. And I, without knowing this story of how she escaped Europe and the courage she showed, and who Aristides Sousa Mendes was, I was inspired by her day-to-day courage and always in awe of her ability to create networks and to connect with people. And I think this is part of that. Again, I return to the third culture kid thing because we have these characteristics, and refugees who are now moving around the world and trying to adapt and to integrate into new communities, we need to look at them with empathy and understand. And the other thing I'd like to add is refugees, as third culture kids, we don't, and again, with the example of Aristides Sousa Mendes and his 14 children who moved around, we don't have a choice. Our parents make that decisions, but refugees are forced out of their homes. They're life-threatening circumstances. They experience these personal tsunamis, which destroys everything they ever know. They have no control. So these are issues of resilience and survival. So I'm always, when I do intercultural work, and coaching, I always try to look for empathy for these traumatic losses and memories. And the last thing I want to say, well, two things. There's a Chinese saying that 1,000 miles starts with one step. So we can't start that one step. We need hope, we need courage. And the last thing I want to say is that we always say never again, but then the stories must be told. We owe it to our families, our descendants, our societies. And when we say that light is a disinfectant, we need to tell these stories for us to heal. And, you know, let us remember those who are brave, who have done things that have helped us on our path to survival and to humanity as a whole.
Henri, what is your closing thought for our audience?
I think actually I said it before, so I'm just going to repeat. This is the example of Sousa Mendes, in addition to what Cookie said, which I think is very relevant. I think that the basic message that I would have, is that we need to tell the story, as you said, Cookie. We have to tell the story to whoever we see that we can share what Sousa Mendes did, and try to get it into the school system. Sousa Mendes was a humanist, a hero of humanity, and his example should be shared with as many people as we can.
Now, Gerald, you're a new grandfather. And so I'm just curious if there are lessons from your own grandfather that you would like to pass on to your grandson.
Well, of course, there's the story, but as you say, lessons of Aristides that are important for the present and the future. So for my little grandson, yes, I would. I think it's important that he learns these lessons, and it's gonna also that it forges who he will be in a way. And yeah, so we live in a very changing world, and it's important that we don't forget the lessons of the past. It's easy to say never again, but we tend to forget. So we need to anchor ourselves to some of these stories, including this one.
Thank you to my guests for a wonderful conversation. Thank you to Gerald de Sousa Mendes, to Henri Dyner and Cookie Fischer from the movie The Legacy of Aristides for joining us.